If Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, Christianity collapses. And one of the world's largest religions, Islam, specifically teaches that he didn't. The Quran says, and for their saying, indeed we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, and they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to them. Now over 1 billion people hold that as truth. Then, in the early 19th century, another theory emerged that had no religion behind it at all. It was known as the Swoon Theory. The idea behind it was that Jesus was so severely weakened by the crucifixion that he just simply lost consciousness and appeared to be dead. The Romans took him down from the cross believing that he was gone. He was wrapped in burial cloths and sealed in a tomb. But he wasn't dead, just barely alive. And inside that tomb, he recovered. He regained consciousness, freed himself from the burial wrappings, and somehow got out of a sealed tomb. And here we have two completely different sources. One that was rooted in religion, and one with no religion behind it at all, but both arriving at the exact same conclusion. Jesus survived the crucifixion. So let's test that against the actual evidence. Now, Jesus' crucifixion is generally dated to around AD 30 to 33. And the earliest historical sources written within decades of those events all describe him as executed under Pontius Pilate. Now, we covered these sources in greater detail in the previous video, but here is the important part. Tacitus, one of Rome's most respected historians, writing around AD 116, recorded that Christus, the founder of the Christian movement, was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus was hostile to Christianity, but he recorded it anyway. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, writing for a Roman audience, also references Jesus being condemned under Pilate. Now, scholars debate whether later Christian copyists had added phrases to a part of Josephus's account. But even the disputed portions do not dispute the execution itself. Now, these are exactly the kinds of sources historians want. People with no stake in the Christian story, recording it because they believed it happened. But notice, across these Roman and Jewish sources alike, there is no confusion at all about who was crucified. There's no substitution, no mistaken identity, no survival. In fact, the very people who demanded Jesus' execution, the ones that wanted him dead, never once claimed the wrong man was crucified. The earliest historical sources, Roman, Jewish, and Christian alike, unanimously identified Jesus as the one executed under Pontius Pilate. Now, the Quran, it was written roughly 6 centuries after these events. The sources placing Jesus on that cross were written within decades of it. See, the debate in antiquity was never whether Jesus died. The debate was what his death meant. To understand why the Swoon Theory struggles historically, we first need to understand what Roman crucifixion actually was. See, crucifixion was not a symbolic punishment. It was an execution method designed to kill slowly, publicly, and brutally. Before a victim was ever nailed to a cross, they were often scourged first, brutally whipped with a leather instrument embedded with bone and metal fragments. These whips tore through skin and muscle. Victims could lose enormous amounts of blood before the crucifixion even began. Some died from the scourging alone. And in Jesus' case, the gospel accounts describe him becoming so physically weakened that he could no longer carry his own crossbeam. Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry it for him. Now that detail matters because it tells us Jesus was already physically collapsing before he even reached the cross. But then came the crucifixion itself. Victims were nailed to wooden beams and left hanging under the weight of their own bodies. Breathing became increasingly difficult. In order to inhale properly, the victim often had to push upward against the nails driven through their feet just to lift their body enough to breathe. Then exhaustion would force them back down again. Over and over, every breath became agony. Blood loss increased. Exhaustion intensified. Shock set in, and the body slowly began shutting down. The Romans were not inexperienced executioners. They knew exactly what crucifixion was designed to do. By the time Jesus had been on the cross for hours, the soldiers assigned to carry out the execution needed to confirm death. The Gospel of John records what happened next. The soldiers came to break the legs of the men crucified alongside Jesus, a common practice used to accelerate death since a victim could no longer push up to breathe. But when they reached Jesus, they saw he was already dead. So instead of breaking his legs, one of the soldiers drove a spear into his side. John chapter 19, verse 34 records, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Many physicians and medical historians have argued this is consistent with death following a severe physical trauma. The soldiers did not break his legs. They had already determined that he was dead. The spear was not an attempt to kill. It was confirmation. And that confirmation matters. Roman soldiers were not careless about this. A soldier who allowed a condemned prisoner to escape, including through a failed execution, could face the death penalty himself. These men had every professional and personal incentive to make sure Jesus was dead. And they were satisfied that he was. But even setting all of that aside, let's for a moment follow the Swoon Theory all the way to its conclusion. Now, the claim was that Jesus survived the crucifixion. That after the scourging, the nails, the hours on the cross, and a spear wound to the side, he was still alive when taken down. That he was wrapped in roughly 75 pounds of burial cloth and spices and placed inside of a sealed tomb. Inside that tomb, there was no medical treatment, no water, no food, no assistance. And then, within 3 days, he somehow freed himself from the burial wrappings, moved the massive stone covering the tomb's entrance from inside the tomb, escaped the tomb, and appeared to his disciples. But think about what that would actually mean. What exactly would the disciples have seen? A man in that physical condition would have been barely able to move. He would have been broken, exhausted, and completely unrecognizable. The sight of him would have not inspired courage and worship. It would have inspired grief and panic. A half-dead man crawling out of a tomb would not convince anyone that he had conquered death. It would convince them he desperately needed help. The Swoon Theory doesn't just struggle with the physical evidence, it struggles with the response it would have produced. The disciples did not react like people who had found a wounded survivor. They reacted like people who believed they had encountered something that defied all explanation entirely. But there's one more question, though, that is worth asking. Has anyone ever actually survived a Roman crucifixion? Now, Josephus, the same first century Jewish historian we referenced earlier, records one known survival case during the Roman siege of Jerusalem around AD 70. Now, by that point, Josephus had surrendered to the Romans and was working with the Roman commander Titus. One day, while on a mission near a village called Thicona, he recognized 3 of his Jewish friends among the men who had been crucified. Horrified, he pled with Titus to have them taken down immediately. Titus granted the request. The men were removed from the cross and given immediate medical treatment. Even then, 2 of the 3 still died. Only 1 survived. Now, compare that to Jesus. Jesus endured full scourging, full crucifixion, a spear wound to the side, was wrapped in burial cloths and spices, placed inside of a sealed tomb, and received no medical treatment at all. When you stack all of that together, the idea that Jesus somehow survived becomes incredibly difficult to believe. Now, at this point, we've looked at the historical record, Roman execution, the spear wound, and why the Swoon Theory falls apart. But here's what makes the conclusion even stronger. It isn't just Christians who affirm that Jesus died by crucifixion. It's scholars who built their careers questioning Christianity completely. Bart Ehrman, an agnostic New Testament scholar and one of the most well-known critics of Christianity today, wrote, "The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life." Dominic Crossan, co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, one of the most skeptical New Testament scholars in the modern history, stated, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Gerard Ludemann, an atheist New Testament professor, wrote in a book arguing against the resurrection. He says Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Now notice what's important here. These scholars disagree strongly about many things, about who Jesus was, whether miracles occurred, and whether the resurrection happened, but they all agree on this. Jesus died by crucifixion. See, this is not a Christian conclusion. It is a historical one. So the historical conclusion is clear. But here's why that matters. Christianity doesn't rest on good teachings or moral examples. It rests on the claim that Jesus actually died and that what happened afterward changed everything. If Jesus didn't die, there is no resurrection. And if there is no resurrection, Christianity collapses entirely. Paul himself said as much in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 17. He says, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile." But the death is confirmed. The historical record is clear. The medical evidence points clearly in the same direction. Even scholars who reject Christianity are clear. Jesus of Nazareth died on that cross. And that means everything he claimed about himself, everything he taught, and everything that is said to have happened after, well, it still demands an answer before the gates.